to the Putting Your Business on the Map podcast. This is the podcast for land surveyors that own or want to own a small business. My name is Landon Blake. I am your podcast host. Let's dive right into today's episode. The title of episode 34 is Managing Your Organization's Liability with Good Documentation. I'm going to start with a story from my own journey as a land surveyor. This happened when I was really young. I'd only been surveying a few years, I think. I may have told this story or a version of it on the podcast before. We were working on a project to build a new water pipeline. It was coming out of one of the rivers here in the Central Valley. It wasn't a super long pipeline. It was maybe a mile and a half. They were large diameter pipes. I think the pipes were 3 or 4 feet in diameter. There was 2 of them. And make a long story short, I had worked on the land net, what we call record land net, for the easement acquisition. And I don't know why. Probably because I was a rebel. But I did, for the first time in the history of the company, I prepared a technical report about the record land net that we assembled. It was pretty simple. It was a half a dozen pages or so, and I put it together in Microsoft Word. It wasn't fancy. A couple years later, there was a big dispute during construction. The contractor had built at least one of the pipes had been built out of the easement that was acquired for the project. And my company had written the easements, the new easements for the pipeline. But we weren't involved in any of the construction surveying. That was another company. So here you go. You got this 4-foot pipe. It's not in the easement as designed. And there was a big dispute. And everybody's, pointing fingers at each other. The city was pointing fingers at the contractor. And the contractor was pointing fingers at the design engineer. And the design engineer was pointing fingers at the surveyor doing the construction layout, and the surveyor doing the construction layout was pointing fingers at us. Anyways, make a long story short, the critical issue to absolve our team of liability was when that information in my report had been provided to the design engineer. Because we provided the information that was needed basically to put the engineer on notice about some issues and get those resolved. And I didn't have a date on my report, anywhere in my report. And because of that, my company ended up paying a claim. Now, we were just a small portion of the overall claim. There was, I think, almost every party in the dispute there ended up, putting something into the pot, ponying up some money. I think it was, I don't know if it was $30,000 or $50,000. It wasn't a small amount of money. And look, I was a young surveyor. I wasn't licensed yet. I had 2 or 3, licensed professionals trying supervising my work, and we'd never even done a technical report before. But one of the principals was obviously disappointed that there wasn't a date on the report. What does that teach you? What does that teach us? It teaches you that project documentation matters in a claim, and even a small detail like a date in a report can be critical to reducing your liability. And I've got more stories like that. That's just one. That's just one of the stories. And if you practice as a land surveyor for very long, you probably have similar stories. The main motivation for me choosing this particular topic for the podcast episode, this is episode 34, I believe, is primarily my work as an expert witness. So I do a fair amount of expert witness work, and it's usually reviewing the work of other land surveyors. And a lot of surveyors are sloppy. They're sloppy, they're not careful, they do dumb stuff, and they don't write good job documentation. I've even had land surveyors tell me, I don't write job documentation because I don't want to have something in the record that that provides my legal opponent with the smoking gun. I don't think that's a good strategy. Just based on my own experience and some conversations I've had with some attorneys, I don't think it's a good strategy. I went to a webinar once. It was a gentleman that was teaching the webinar was a surveyor and an attorney. And he said something to the effect of, there's nothing worse than having to defend a poorly dressed and poorly documented land surveyor. So I think good documentation is important. I think people make excuses to not do it. And I know why. Producing job documentation sucks. It's a pain in the butt. I don't like doing it. Most of my team members don't like doing it. But it doesn't mean it's not important. It's like billing. Billing's important too. I don't like billing, but it's really important. Before we get into the overview of what we're going to talk about today, let's take a minute and just briefly discuss, why is this important? Managing your survey organization's liability with good job documentation. It's important because a large claim can lead to bankruptcy. So it's kind of the worst outcome, right? Your company becomes insolvent. It's important because a large claim or a number of smaller claims can lead your organization to become uninsurable. In other words, you either can't get professional liability insurance or it's too expensive to operate as a business. Fighting claims costs you time and money. And fighting claims also causes you stress. Now, I want to just give you a little caveat here. I don't know that good documentation necessarily prevents a claim or a dispute. It could, but it puts you in a strong negotiating position when there is a claim, and it can end a claim early. So it can help you either dismiss a claim or get a claim resolved early in the process, which saves time and money. I want you to remember, even if you can't prevent a claim with good job documentation, you can often resolve it early and settle it for less if you have good job documentation. So even in the worst scenario where there is a claim, good job documentation is going to help you resolve the claim quickly and for as little money as possible. What are we going to talk about in our episode today? We are going to talk about, we're going to answer, 2 questions. What type of liability are we talking about? When I say you can manage your survey organization's liability with good job documentation, what am I talking about? What type of liability am I talking about? 2, we're going to talk about what type of documents do you need. So when I say job documents, what am I describing? I have 2 or 3 different categories of job documents, and we'll talk about what those are. So let's start with that first question. Question number one, what type of liability are we trying to manage here? And there's really two types of liability that I'm talking about that good job documentation can help you minimize. So the first is professional liability. And that's what your professional liability insurance policy covers. And the basic question that a court is trying to answer there, or an arbitrator, is, did this surveyor meet the standard of care in his work, or did he fail to meet, or did she fail to meet the standard of care? And there's some challenges there for that decision maker or arbitrator. Standard of care is not a black and white concept. It's kind of squishy. It's kind of fuzzy. Right? Standard of care can vary from place to place. It's not always clear, especially in challenging or complex situations, what the standard of care should be. So that makes it difficult. So given the squishy nature of the standard of care, what can you do as a land surveyor to avoid paying a claim under this standard of professional liability, this standard of care? Number one, don't be a bonehead. I tell surveyors all the time, don't hop a 100-year-old fence and go 50 feet into the neighbor's yard and set your monument without having a conversation with your client and your neighbor. That's stupid. Don't do it. It's a good way to get a claim. Practice well above the standard of care. You can think of the standard of care as kind of a fuzzy gray line, right? It's fuzzy, right? Well, just be make sure you're way above the line. Don't even get into the fuzzy area. Right? That's what we try and do here at RH. We try and practice well above the minimum standard of care. And then know what your minimum level of effort is every survey has some minimum level of effort that you have to perform at to meet the standard of care. Don't go below that, even if the client tells you to. You can't contract away your obligation to meet the minimum standard of care because you're a professional. I'll give you an example. The client says, I don't want to pay to check adjoiner deeds or look for gaps and overlaps with adjoiner deeds. You just mark what's in my deed and just do that. That'll save me some money. If you do that and there's a dispute with a neighbor, you can get sued. And you can't say, well, my client agreed that I didn't have to follow the minimum standard of care and check the adjoiner deeds. That doesn't work. It's not a valid defense, what they call a valid defense. You can't contract away your obligation to meet the minimum standard of care. So there's some minimum level of effort that you have to meet to do that. It reminds me of, I got hired to review a control survey that one of my peer companies had done for one of our local cities. They had gone in and done a bunch of leveling work. The city wanted to update its benchmark book and its vertical datum. And they didn't do a good job. The deliverable sucked, and it was a mess. And I think they did a fairly good job on the leveling work, but the deliverable was horrible. And they should have done a lot more. And so, so that's basically what I told the city, my report. I said, hey, it looks like they did a fair amount of leveling work here and some GPS control work, but it's hard for me to evaluate what they did based on the deliverables you got. I'm like, yeah, I can see from the quality of deliverables you got why you might have some concerns. So we ended up having a meeting. It was me, a land surveyor from the other company, and the city. We sat down to discuss my review of their work. And at some point in the conversation, the other surveyor, who I knew was a good guy, I like him. I still like him. He basically said, well, he's retired now. But he basically said, well, the city didn't want to pay for us to do it the right way. So we gave them what they paid for, basically. And at the end of the meeting, of course, the city wasn't happy with that answer. But at the end of the meeting, I kind of looked at these two parties here, the land surveyor and the public works director for the city. And I said, look, you guys basically deserve each other. I said, and there's blame here on both sides. I said, city, you wanted a coupon deal and you got what you paid for. And Bill was the other surveyor's name. I said, Bill, you shouldn't have agreed to do work for the city that you knew was substandard because you weren't getting paid enough. You should have demanded a fair price to do the minimum level of effort, or you should have walked away from the job. They didn't want to hear that. Neither one of them wanted to hear that, but the meeting ended, and at some point in the next week or two, there was some agreement that I was probably right, that the city should have probably paid more for the work, and that the surveyor shouldn't have took the work for the price that they agreed to, and they kind of met in the middle there. The city agreed to cough up a little more money, and the surveyor agreed to eat some of the cost, and they got some revised deliverables to me, and things ended up shaking out there without a lawsuit or a claim. But that's an example of, sometimes your client isn't willing to pay you enough to even meet the minimum standard of care. You got to walk away from the job, land surveyors, in that situation. I'm sorry, I got off on a little bit of a tangent there, but that's what professional liability is and how it's related to the standard of care. That's the first type of liability. The second type of liability that we're talking about today is what they call breach of contract. And that's where you basically don't do what you told the client you were going to do. It's separate from professional liability. So you can be held liable under the standard of care for something that's not in your contract. And you can be held liable for something that's in your contract that's above the standard of care. So these things are not mutually exclusive. It's like a Venn diagram, right? I need to do a PYDOT extra where we do a Venn diagram and look at some examples of this. But so that's the other type of liability that we're worried about here that we can manage with our job documentation. So how do you minimize some of this liability? You always use a written contract. You include a comprehensive scope of services that a layperson or a common person can understand. And you use plain language. One paragraph is probably not enough, especially for a complicated project. If you agree to follow a specification as part of your work, you actually read the specification and make some efforts to actually do what the specification requires. And again, if you get a dispute over breach of contract, the judge or the arbitrator isn't going to care if you gave your client a coupon deal. That is not a get out of jail free card. You can't look at the arbitrator and say, well, arbitrator, the client didn't really pay a fair price for this. I gave him a good deal. And so I felt like I didn't have to do what I said I was going to do in the contract. That doesn't work. You would be surprised at the surveyors who say something like that. A little side note here, you are especially vulnerable for breach of contract and professional liability, these two types of liability that we talk about, if you're working for a client that isn't sophisticated. So the less experienced your client, the more a judge or an arbitrator is going to expect you as a licensed professional to be looking out for your client's interests. As a licensed professional with an unsophisticated client, you don't do dumb stuff just because your client tells you to. That's not a valid defense. The judge or the arbitrator is going to look at you and say, you're the licensed professional. You're supposed to tell your client that you're not going to do stuff like this and explain why. All right, there you go. You can tell I get a little fired up about this. So there's the two types of liability. Let me just take a quick break here. I'll just mention briefly, if you're interested in implementing GIS at your surveying or engineering organization, but you're not sure how to get started, one way you can do that is with QGIS. It's a really cool open source GIS desktop program. We use it here at RH every day. All of my surveyors know how to use it. It's a fantastic program. We can help you get started if you're interested in doing that. Give us a call. Reach out to me by email. Let us know that you're thinking about it, but you're a little uncertain. You're not sure what to do. And we can help you. You can do that in baby steps. And I tell people all the time, it doesn't take $1 million. You don't need an ArcGIS server. Super easy to get started with QGIS. Take some of that money that you would spend on software licenses with Esri for ArcGIS and let us use some of that money to give your team GIS design services, training, and get you off the ground with QGIS. It's a great tool. And then the nice thing about that approach is you never have to spend money on software licensing again for GIS because you'll be using QGIS, which is what we use here at RH. So check that out. RH is our sponsor. I appreciate that they sponsor the podcast. So reach out to me and my team at RH if you're interested, and we can get you some help with QGIS. The second question we wanted to answer in the episode today is, what type of job documents are we talking about? So we just discussed the two types of liability you need to manage, professional liability and breach of contract. What kind of job documents can help you do that? Can help you minimize or manage your level of liability? So I have three broad categories of documents that we're going to talk about. The first one is contract documents. The second one is important communications. And the third one is technical reports. And I'll go through those in detail. So let's start with the first one, contract docs. Every job should have a set of contract documents. At our shop, we have a folder right at the root of the job folder. It's called contracts, is where we put all this stuff. So what kind of thing am I talking? What kind of documents am I talking about when I say contract documents? Your scope of services. You always have a written scope of services. It should always describe what tasks you're going to complete for the client. It should have a project description. It should have a schedule. It should have a cost breakdown of some type. It should have a list of exclusions and understandings. As I mentioned before, if you have a complicated project, that should probably be more than a paragraph. I'm often surprised in the expert witness work I do how many times the surveyor will have a scope that says something like, perform a boundary survey. And that's it. That's the whole scope. There's a lot of different ways to interpret that, folks. Remember, one of the things you can be liable for is breach of contract. If you have a one-sentence scope that says perform boundary survey, there's a lot of questions I have as an expert witness. Does that include easement mapping? Does it include chain of title research? Does it include placement of monuments and filing a record of survey with the county? Does it include, negotiating boundary line agreements with the neighbor? Does it include writing a corrective legal description? Does it include an ALTA survey? I have all kinds of questions about that scope. So don't do that. Have a reasonably detailed scope. You should also save all of your additional service requests What is that? Some surveyors call them change orders. I don't like to use the term change orders. That's what contractors get. We're professionals. We get a request for an additional professional service. So you start a job, you're doing a boundary survey, the client realizes they need a topographic survey, they ask you to do a topographic survey. That should be documented in an additional service request. It should get its own scope and its own fee and its own schedule. And that should get documented. We do ASR 1, ASR 2, ASR 3. We just put new subfolders in our contract folder. They all get their own scope. You'd have your subconsultant or subcontractor agreements. You should keep those. So if we're using a utility locator, or we've hired a land attorney, or we've hired an environmental consultant, sometimes we'll hire, or an archaeologist. We keep those agreements in our contract folder. You should have your proposal cover letter and what we call supplements. So our proposal, we do a proposal cover letter because a lot of clients don't read your scope, but they will typically, if you can keep your cover letter to a page and a half or less, they will sometimes read your cover letter. So our cover letter typically summarizes kind of our understanding of the project and what their needs are and the services we're going to provide and the payment terms and the schedule. Then we have supplements. Those are things we like to drop in with the proposal. They're usually 1 page, sometimes 2 page, and they're things that we want to put the client on notice about. So like we have one for records of survey, we have one for land development in California, we have one for utility locating. It's helpful information that we want to provide to the client that explains what they're paying for and what some of the risks and uncertainties are. You want to save your invoices and your payment receipts. So we have a billing folder at our shop at RH. Every invoice goes in there. All our payment receipts go in there. You want to be able to prove what work you were paid for and what work you weren't paid for. Sometimes that becomes an issue in a claim. Somebody says, well, Landon didn't do the final parcel map. And I have to go back and say, yeah, I know, but you never paid me for it. Well, prove you didn't pay me for it. Well, here's the invoice I sent you. Here, we never got payment. Can you prove that you sent payment? Like here's your first invoice and our proof that you paid the first invoice. But there's no proof of payment for the second invoice because you never paid it. So those things can become issues in claims. So you want to keep good billing documentation and keep copies of all your invoices and your receipts, payment receipts. I have another side note in my outline here that I'll just mention briefly. You can be liable for extra work that you provide the client that they don't pay for. So just because a client doesn't pay for it doesn't mean you're not liable for it. That's one reason why I don't like to do extra work that isn't falling under an ASR, and I usually am going to ask the client that we get paid for it. We will occasionally do extra work for a client and not ask to get paid, but even in a situation where you're not getting paid, you should have an ASR because you want to limit in writing the scope of what you're providing to the client, especially if they're going to rely on it. So don't think that just because you're not getting paid for extra work that's a get out of jail free card. It might not be. The second category of documents we wanted to talk about was important communications about the job. In 2025, this is primarily email. So manage your email. Don't write emails like an attorney. I have a client that does that, and it's super irritating. It always puts me on the defensive, and a lot of times I wish they would just pick up the phone and call me if they had a concern. When you do that, when you write an email like you're an attorney, it's aggressive and confrontational. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't write good emails. Be clear, be straightforward in your email communication. Defend yourself if you need to, but be polite. You're not writing a legal document. You're not writing documents for a lawsuit. And if you do that, you're going to get everybody's, hackles up. Be honest, be clear, be straightforward, use plain language. If somebody says Landon made a mistake on the boundary survey and now now the concrete we poured for the foundation of the building is going to violate the building setback. And if somebody says that in an email, you want to quickly correct the record there. Say, I disagree with the facts that were just stated. Give me some time and I'll prepare a response to that. You don't even have to necessarily immediately respond with your version. of the facts or the events, but you could say, I disagree with what was said, and I need some time to correct the record or to put forward our position on what's happened here. And, we're committed to working with everybody to find a solution, but, I strongly disagree with some of the accusations that have been made or some of the, with the position that Team X is taking. It's okay to say that. You want to do that. You don't want to leave those things uncorrected in the record. But you don't have to be an attorney. You can be a human being. And I don't think people lose lawsuits because they failed to write an email like an attorney. I've never seen that happen in my time as an expert witness. Now, I've seen people write stupid emails, but there's a difference, right? There's a difference between writing a clear, plain, straightforward, yet friendly email and an email where you tell somebody they're stupid, a stupid mother effer, their mama must have been, on crack cocaine and they're a liar and a cheat. Like, you don't do that. That's not professional. It's not going to make you look good. Don't write dumb emails like that. But you don't have to write emails like you're an attorney either. When there's an issue with a client or another consultant on a project, I find it helps to have a phone call. I don't like conflict, and so sometimes I lean too heavily on email. One of the things my former partner Danny helped me with is sometimes you just have to pick the phone up. It makes a difference when you're talking to somebody on the phone or you're meeting with them in person. And I find that's the best way early on to try and resolve disputes. There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, we had a phone call or meeting today. Here's what I took away from that. Is that what you took away from it? Did I miss anything? That's a great non-aggressive way to kind of summarize the verbal communication in an email. But don't rely on verbal communication for important direction. If you're nervous about something, ask for a letter. I don't even like doing risky stuff based on an email. I like to ask for a letter. I find frequently when I do that, especially with people at government agencies, they'll tell me in an email or on a phone call, well, just do this, do X. And I'll say, hey, I have no problem doing X, but I have some concerns about it. I would like you to tell me in a quick email with your business signature, your government agency signature, or in a short, write me a 1-page letter on your organization letterhead that instructs me to do X. You know what? 90% of the time, I find when I ask for direction writing like that for things that are making me uncomfortable, people back down. And they say, well, I can't do that. I can't give you that direction in writing. Oh, well, why not? Well, because it's really your decision. It's not our decision. Okay, well, if it's really my decision, then I'm going to do Y, not X. So don't rely on verbal communication for important direction or instructions. There's an art to politely asking for that direction in writing, and sometimes you need to do that because people will run their mouths and ask you to do stuff that's not in your best interest when they don't have the authority to do that. Another type of communication that we work really hard at here at RH, and we need to do better. We need to do better. I should have mentioned that. We're working to get better at all these things, so I don't want you guys to feel like I'm on my soapbox preaching at you. This is hard, and it takes constant effort, and we're getting better. Another thing we try and do in the communication category is prepare what we call a job status report. It's somewhere between 1 and 3 pages, and it's a standard report. They all look the same sections. What work did we just complete? What work are we doing next? What recommendations or red flags do we have for you? We try and send those with every invoice. I don't know. We got maybe a 50% hit rate on that. So we can improve, but we try and send it with every invoice. Put yourself in the client's position. What's the client paying for? Send them a little job status report that lets them know, hey, here's our bill. Here's what we've done. Here's what you're paying us for. Here's what we're working on next. I've had job status reports take us out of a potential construction dispute very early in the process. And we don't do construction surveying, but we do design surveys that are used for construction. There's been a couple times in the last 5 years where somebody's pointed the finger at our team on a potential construction dispute that's brewing. And we've said, hey, see this job status report dated March 25th where we told you, You needed to, we recommended that you map underground utilities based on what we saw during the field survey, and we gave you an optional task to do that with a fee, and you declined. Guess what? We're out of the dispute at that point. So those job status reports are really important. I think it helps the client understand what they're paying for when you send them with an invoice, and it also helps you manage your liability. All right, let me take a quick break. Hang on, because now my phone alarm's going on. All right, sorry about that. I'm obviously still working on being a good podcast host because I forgot to turn down my phone. Okay, the third category of job documents that we're going to talk about are technical reports. Of the three categories, this is the most frequently neglected category by land surveyors. I think we do worse at this than other professionals do. In some other professions, like if you're an archaeologist or a biologist or geologist, like the technical report is the whole deliverable. Man, surveyors, we really suck at this. We deliver surveys in CAD drawings. We deliver maps in CAD drawings, and there's never a technical report. It blows my mind. I think all of the expert witness work I have never done, I have never gotten a technical report when I've asked for one, ever. Surveyors just don't do them. You should be preparing technical reports for every survey. It's part of being a professional. A map or a CAD drawing is not enough. That does not have enough metadata. I put a ton of notes on my maps, way more notes on my maps than your average surveyor, and I still like to prepare a technical report. I understand writing technical reports is like having a hole drilled into your cranium without anesthesia. They suck. It's miserable. But it's important. It's really important. So we commonly deliver three types of technical reports here. We deliver boundary survey reports, we deliver survey control reports, and we deliver topographic survey reports. I would say 90% of our jobs here get a boundary survey report and a survey control report at a minimum. And then, another third probably get a topographic survey report. There's other types of reports we do, special reports. We'll do a report for utility mapping. If we've done utility locating and mapping, we have a special report that we do for our forest surveys. We have a special report we put together when we do record land nets for right-of-way mapping. I have a special report format that I follow for expert witness work that talks about my conclusions and the legal principles that I apply to my reasoning. So all of those are really important. Since I'm doing these on YouTube now, I'm going to real quick, I want to show you guys at the end here, I'm going to jump in and just show you quick. I'll turn my screen recording back on and I'll jump in and I'll show you a quick example of a technical report. To review, what type of job documents will help you manage your surveying organization's liability? We talked about contract documents. We talked about important job communications. And we talked about technical reports. Right? Of those three, technical reports is the most neglected. If you're listening to this episode and you're like, man, Landon is right. I don't do any technical reports. That's a huge problem. I need to start doing this. Reach out to me. Reach out to my team at Redefine Horizons. We will send you our technical report templates. No charge. I will send them to you with examples. We want to raise the standard of practice in the profession. I have no problem sharing those with you. If you do your first technical report and you're like, man, I'm not sure if this is what I should be doing, send it to me. I will review it. I will not charge you. I will give you comments back on your first technical report. I might even peer review your first 2 or 3. No charge. I want to help you. You might have to wait a week or two for me to do it, but I'm willing to do that because I want to help other surveyors and I want to help us as a profession to raise the standard of practice. Okay, let me take a quick drink of my tea here. All right, don't forget, if you're currently using Google Earth to track things like your survey jobs, the location of your survey jobs and their status, QGIS is probably a better solution for you. Reach out to the team at Redefine Horizons. We can help you migrate from Google Earth to QGIS. Super simple. QGIS actually imports and exports KML files and KMZ files, so you can continue using Google Earth while you make the migration. Another great thing about QGIS is you can zip up your QGIS projects and take them into the field with you on a mobile device with Mergen Maps. It does not require a cell phone connection, a network connection, which is super cool. That's one of the ways we use QGIS here at Redefine Horizons. Reach out to my team if you're interested in learning more about that. We can have kind of an initial conversation with you about it. And if it's something you want to pursue, we can prepare a proposal to get you some professional services. You can super easily transition from Google Earth to QGIS, which is a real desktop GIS software, open source. Doesn't cost anything. You can download it right now today. Start playing around with it, the fully featured version. I encourage you to do that. Okay, to wrap up our podcast episode, we're going to talk about best practices, just some tips and best practices about documentation that I wanted to share with you. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so here's the first one. We do a horrible job of this at Redefine Horizons. We are working to get better. It's one of the things on my to-do list. But when a job hits a major milestone or you're closing it out, go in and perform a file and folder audit. So in other words, go in, you say, hey, for this type of job, for a monument preservation job, we need to have this set of documents in our job folder when we're done. You go in, you have a project coordinator or assistant surveyor or somebody like that in your organization do an audit, and they can come back to you and say, hey, you're supposed to have a boundary survey report and you don't. You're supposed to have a minimally constrained network adjustment report for your control and you don't. That will help you address gaps in your project documentation. Best practice number 1, perform folder audits. Number 2, create a system to store and organize important email communications. We do that in Outlook with a shared folder. Each job gets its own folder where we can, each team member can store emails from the job. One of the other things that I'm interested in doing is using Microsoft Power Automate to export all the emails in a job folder to PDF format at the end of the job. When we archive a project, that can then get loaded into a deep learning tool like Google Notebook LM, and you can actually run natural language queries against that master PDF files of all the job emails. So it's super cool. Check out YouTube. I have a video where I show you how to do that. It's super cool. Super geeked out on it. So create a system to store and organize important email communications and to archive them. Tip number 3, or best practice number 3, create a system to retain and back up your digital documents. So you need to have a way to back that stuff up. So we back up to OneDrive here. We also back up to a local network attached storage device in our basement. And then we also archive projects to Google Drive and on disk. Also, we have offsite disks and we upload it to Google Drive. So we have a multiple backup solution there. And if you need to do that, right? So don't just have your documents on your hard drive on your 1989 Windows XP computer, 1995 Windows XP computer. That's a bad way to do it. Okay, so you got to think through that. Maybe work with an IT consultant to come up with a way to back up your documents. Number 3, learn to record your calculations and your professional judgments. If I can remember, we'll try and do a PYB OTeam Extra where I talk about that and show you some examples. Again, another area where surveyors we really do a bad job, like way worse than a lot of other professions. If you're a structural engineer and you design a structure, you typically have some documents about the calculations you use. As surveyors, we just don't do that. So I'll try and walk through like a boundary surveying example and then maybe a non-boundary surveying example of how you can document your calculations and your professional judgments. So you should do that. You can get those into your technical reports. Maybe you don't. Maybe they don't go into your technical reports. Maybe you summarize them in your technical reports, but you want to be able to go back after you've done work and answer some questions, right, about how you came up with the answers that you came up with. Best practice number 5, don't make risk tolerance decisions for your client. That's one thing my partner Kevin Genesi has really helped me learn. Communicate the level of risk or uncertainty to your client and let them decide what risk tolerance they have. Here's something surveyors do all the time. They're doing a boundary survey. There's some ambiguity in the deeds, or maybe there's a little gap in overlap. They don't talk to the client about that. They just pick an answer and slam monuments in the ground. Right? The client builds a condo tower. All of a sudden, they're getting sued by the neighbor. The surveyor says, well, I saw that ambiguity in the deed, but, I made my best judgment call on where the boundary was, and I think it was reasonable. And the client's like, yeah, but if you would have told me that there was some uncertainty, I would have worked with the neighbor, and we could have, I'd have put a bigger buffer in between the building and the property line. So Now, why am I talking about that in an episode about job documentation? That ties in with the professional judgments you make, and you need to find a way to communicate that uncertainty to your client. You can do that in a job status report. Hey, here's some judgment calls we made. Some of the things, some of these elements of your project where we've made a judgment call. Alternative judgments can be made. Here's what those might be and how that might impact your project. You can do that in a job status report. You can do it in a technical report that you provide to the client. But think about it. Maintain a report template library. That is best practice number 6, I believe. So we have a template library that we use, report template library. You can go in and say, I'm going to do a boundary survey report, or I'm going to do a control survey report. So keep a template library so you make sure that you're getting the same critical information into every report. And the last thing, this is best practice number 7, is demand that docs are complete before job is closed and the final deliverable is made to the client. This is another thing we're really horrible about here at our Redefined Horizons. We're trying to do better at it, but I frequently find I'm going back to an old project and then we're having to go back and do the project documentation long after the project's finished. So I need to do better about making sure that our technical reports and our folder audit of the job are done before we make the final deliverable to the client, because once you make the final deliverable to the client, it's really hard to get that done, right? It just sits and gets pushed to the back burner. And you want that documentation to go, some of that documentation should be going to the client in the final deliverable anyways, right? Like your technical reports. So you want to be able to do that. Okay, let me stop this recording. I'm going to restart it and just give you guys just a 3-minute overview of what a technical report at RH looks like in the episode. All right, guys, so if you're on YouTube, you should be able to see this. I've just opened up our boundary survey report template, and I'm just going to show this guy's, I've just opened our boundary survey report template. It's one of the technical reports we provide. This actually goes to the client in the deliverable. And so I'm going to give you guys a quick overview of this. So we've got our cover page here. This is not fancy. We identify the subject parcels. We review the deeds. We review the filed survey maps. We review any other maps. We talk about the field surveys we performed. We described the controlling elements of the vesting deed land description. That's part of our boundary resolution. And we also describe the monuments and the other field evidence of the boundary location as part of our boundary resolution. And then we have an appendix that describes our boundary research. So you can see here, we've got the identification of the subject parcel. On this particular job, I actually didn't get a deed. It was a lease parcel and they didn't have a deed. So I was working off of some exhibits, which was crazy. Here I talk about the survey maps and we break that out, the controlling map, any retracing maps, adjoining maps, and then, we just provide some basic information. Who did it? Who was the surveyor? What date was it? We have a short 1-paragraph summary. We talk about any other maps. So in this case, I had an unrecorded, I think it was an ALTA survey, an unrecorded ALTA survey of the lease parcel. So I talk about that a little bit. We tell them about the field surveys we performed, what equipment we used, and what methods. It's short, just a paragraph. Might be a couple paragraphs. Then I talk about, all right, how do we resolve the controlling elements in the vesting deed? What were they? And, how did we locate them onto the ground? Then we talk about all right, what evidence did we find of the boundary? This section usually has the same subsections, found original controlling monuments, found retracement monuments, other monuments we searched for but did not find. And we talk about the physical occupation along the subject parcel boundaries. Then we have an appendix that just briefly describes where we did our research. It's not super complicated, guys, right? This is, I don't know, this thing is, how many pages is this? It's 10 pages. It's only 1,000 words. Super helpful information. And probably could be improved. There isn't a doubt in my mind that this could be improved. But it's better than what you get from most surveyors. You get a map and none of this information is included. How'd you do your field survey? I don't know. What did you find in your field survey? I don't know. Where'd you do your research? I don't know. Did you find this map? Did this map have an impact on your boundary resolution? I don't remember. And you don't want to be that surveyor, right? So that's an example of what a good technical report looks like. All right, I think I managed to keep this to about 45 minutes, which is awesome. Appreciate you guys listening. Hopefully, if you're on YouTube, it helped to just kind of see what one of those reports look like. Let me know. I'll send you these templates. If you get them and you have suggestions, get those back to us. We'll integrate your suggestions into our report templates. So thank you for listening. Next episode, what are we talking about on our next episode? We are going to talk about content marketing and how you can use content marketing in your land surveying and mapping business. I geek out on content marketing, so I'm looking forward to that one. That's going to be episode 35, I believe. And just to let you guys know, we're still working on the book. Its progress has been slow because I've been super busy at work, but we are making slow but steady progress on the book. I hope to get some of the initial chapters laid out this week. So pay attention to the Patreon page. And then I will let you know, I think episode 32 was a bonus episode, so that's up on the Patreon page. If you support us with $10 a month, you can listen to that on Patreon. I think you can also listen to it on Spotify if you're a Patreon supporter. So check that out. $10 a month. You can help me support the podcast. And thanks, guys, for listening. As we close out the episode, we just want to give you guys a few reminders. First, we want to let you know where you can find the podcast episodes. The podcast home on the web is at my personal website, landonblake.com. If you head there and look under the Learn menu, you'll find a link for the podcast. That homepage for the podcast has all of the episodes. You can download those in MP3 format if you'd like, or read the show notes. You can also find the podcast on Spotify, YouTube, and Amazon Music. So if those are your preferred, one of those is your preferred distribution channel, you can find the podcast there. We also want to let you guys know, if you'd like to sponsor the podcast, you can reach out to me, sunburn.surveyor@gmail.com. You can also send me questions, comments, thank yous, topic suggestions for the podcast. I regularly get that kind of feedback from listeners, and I dig it. I appreciate hearing from you guys, so I encourage you to do that. We also have a Patreon page. If you cruise over to Patreon, you can search for On Point Workshops, and you will find the podcast there. You can, for a small monthly donation, I believe right now it's $10 a month, you can support the podcast and get access to what we call PYD OTM extras. So those are extra videos, short audio files, and even full episodes of the podcast. And that support on Patreon allows me to keep Carly around. Carly is the fantastic young lady that helps me edit the podcast and maintain the podcast website. We'd like to keep her around, so we appreciate your support on Patreon if you're able to do that. And thank you for being a listener.